Welcome to the Learning From series, where we study great drummers and instead of learning exact licks and transcriptions that you are bound to forget next week, we extract simple concepts and systems that you can immediately apply in your own drumming. Today, we learn from one of the GOATs and one of my personal biggest influences, Dave Weckl. What we're going to learn from Dave Weckl today is how he makes his drumming breathe dynamically. By breathe, I'm referring to the very unique way in which he uses dynamics. His dynamics are almost always momentarily crescendoing and decrescendoing, getting louder and softer. That's why I've always felt like his drumming breathes. It makes it feel extremely human. And this is one of the defining characteristics of his sound. Listen to this example now with this in mind, and then let's hop on the kit. Let's look at 5 things Dave does to create this effect that we can borrow for our own playing. The first one is the simplest: general crescendos during rolls, like he does in this clip from The Chicken with Dave Weckl Band. Or this clip, listen for the crescendo. This is a relatively slow, straightforward crescendo that you can try anytime you're moving singles around the drums. You can give it a crescendo, a decrescendo. A lot of times what Dave does is crescendo into a big accent, right? It might sound something like this if I'm just playing around with it. If you like what I'm doing on the channel, the easiest way to support it is by subscribing, liking, and commenting. It's hugely appreciated. The second dynamic Daveism is when you're playing 2 or 3 accents next to each other, on a tom or on the snare drum. Often the first accent will be softer than the final one, or if there are 3 accents, they'll build up to a louder final accent. So listen to me just demonstrating this a little bit. Listen for it in this clip from Spain with Chick Corea. Did you hear it? He does it every time he goes to the toms there. Now, this runs super contrary to a lot of modern drumming, where your goal is to set your accent volume and your ghost note volume and lock it in. The ability to be consistent with that dynamic depth is something that we work very hard to achieve, and we should. But once we can do that, we can start to play with it. You don't want it to be changing accidentally, haphazardly, but if you do it with intent, like Dave, then you can move beyond this sort of binary volume world into something more like what Dave is doing, that's more expressive, that gives this feeling of breathing. Here's me trying to demonstrate this with vocabulary from my paradiddles and doubles subset course, which is kind of perfect for this because it's full of groups of 2, 3, 4, and 5 accents in a row. The third Davism is the opposite of the previous one. In the previous one, we had the accent layer moving. Now, what we're talking about here is locking in the accent layer and swelling the ghost note layer independently. So, as a really bare bones example, if I'm playing a paradiddle, just the rudiment itself, pay attention to how the ghost notes can fluctuate in volume while I try my best to keep the accent steady. And I could do this with any rudiment that has accents and ghost notes. For example, a 6-stroke roll, which is going to have this natural fluidity to it already. Now listen for this in this clip from Dave Weckl. This is the same one as before, but this time pay attention to the breathing of the ghost notes. This is a really fun move to try with your existing vocabulary. Whatever you feel comfortable doing that has accents and ghost notes, try locking in a pattern or improvising if you're comfortable with it and adjusting the volume of only the ghost note layer. I'll demonstrate again using some of that vocab from the paradiddles and double subset course because there are a ton of ghost notes in it. Right, and you can try this with basically any pattern that you feel comfortable doing. If I loop right, left, kick, right, another challenging but useful pattern here, and I add a bunch of ghost notes with my hands. Watch this, 3 into 4 into. That's 2 layers of dynamics locked in place. But now watch what happens when I give it some life on the ghost note layer. 3 into 4 into. And then of course you have triplet vocabulary, like from my triplet flow series, that's really gonna thrive with this move because so many of those patterns have a sort of a natural dynamic flow to them, like I mentioned with the 6-stroke roll. So if I'm improvising with that material, it's really conducive to this type of swelling of the dynamics on the ghost note layer. The fourth dynamic Davism is starting rolls loud and then quieting them down immediately. There is a term for this that I could barely remember from Berkeley. Sforzando? Is that it? Someone can correct me in the comments. And someone can try to spell that as well, which is sort of the opposite of the second idea. This is where you come in hot and then scata, and then you're low. And you can see Dave do this a bunch, right? If I, in a very simplified way, do this, the paradiddle diddle is a great way to start this because you have the para strong, and then you can start diddling quietly. Listen for Dave doing this in this clip. The easiest way to apply this in your own playing is probably, if you're comfortable, putting in a single or double kick into the flow, because that frees up your hands to get to that accent. So if I do this kind of slowly, Right? A few variations there where you have a double kick, a single kick, or you're going into the left hand downbeat, the right hand downbeat, worth experimenting with. And for the fifth and final dynamic Daveism, I want to switch into the groove world and look specifically at how Dave creates these momentary swells constantly while he plays linear-ish grooves. The original recording of Gotta Match, which was a huge transformative recording for me to listen to, is a perfect example. Specifically, listen for this, right? The melody is da, da, da. Boom, boo, boo, da, doom, doo, doo, da, doom. And there's a, right when the melody starts, there's a perfect example of Dave doing this. He goes 1, 2, 3, 4. And he has this moment where he's, and if I were to put that all in the snare drum, you'd hear the swell. There's this beautiful little crescendo in there. And he plays this kind of stuff in his groove playing all the time. If I just play around with this sort of idea, this is not the transcription from that song. So you can hear really clearly there, instead of this is the accent volume, this is the ghost note volume, there is this dynamicness to the dynamics. You can feel it swelling and breathing all the time. So with that in mind, listen to the intro here of Gotta Match. So to try to apply this in your own playing, if you're comfortable already playing some linear grooves or improvising linear grooves, one of the easiest ways to start building this in is every time you play a double with your right hand, play the first note softer and the second one stronger. So if I'm playing a melody here on the hi-hat, you've got some and then if I vary the ghost notes to sort of correspond with that, and if you're totally new to linear grooves, one thing you can try is just playing a paradiddle as a groove. So you play right hand up here, left hand here, play a paradiddle. Kick drum on one. Drop the left hand ghost notes and make a differentiation between your accent and your ghost note. Here we're locking in those really sort of standard boring dynamics. And then try this with that double on your right hand. Right, 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 right there. And it already gives it more life. You can even try with those left hand doubles at the end of it. Right, left, right, left, left, left. And now we're giving a little more dynamic complexity to that groove. That's not necessarily a right or wrong, better or worse thing to do. It's just a different way of thinking about the dynamics. So before I try to use all of these Daveisms together, it feels important to mention that in this series, my goal is not to flatten or oversimplify great drummers drumming. Dave is one of the greatest drummers of all time. Everything from his feel, his touch, tone, groove, his creativity, his musicality, and of course the actual technical vocabulary that he uses was boundary pushing and played a huge role, pun intended, in defining modern drumming. The Daveisms we've covered in this chapter are simply meant to help us channel some of that Weckl sound and help us get more creative juice out of our existing vocabulary. That's what listening to the greats is for. Now, here's me trying to use all of these tools we just talked about. I'm channeling Dave the best I can, which is a great pleasure because, like I said, he's one of my biggest influences, and I have spent countless hours listening to him. Thanks, Dave Weckl, for the never-ending inspiration, and thank you for watching.